I will invite right now Jon Bradford on stage for the next panel. I'm super, super excited to be interviewing Jon today. Ha. So Jon is, what are you called? The father of the European accelerator ecosystem.
The Godfather.
The Godfather,
which just
yes.
makes me just very old.
Yeah, not exactly. I don't know if when people talk about Jon as the godfather of the accelerator ecosystem in Europe, they count MVP Academy that was done by How to Web, because he wasn't officially, I think, one of the founders there, but he definitely played a very important part in that. In 2013, I think, at Springboard, Bogdan Iordache was the program manager, and that's where the team at How to Web kind of learned the business of doing an accelerator. So I will ask Jon to please tell us a bit about what your experience has been so far doing accelerators and further on getting to work with corporates, because the main topic for today will be collaborating between corporates and startups.
So thank you. And it's not often I get to say that Bogdan worked for me. He was actually quite a good employee. I think it was the last time he was employed by somebody. So I had the good fortune about 10 years ago of meeting a guy called David Cohen. And David was the guy who's helped set up Techstars. And because he's just a warm and cuddly, nice sort of a guy, he said, "How can I help?" And I've been asking that question ever since. But essentially, he helped me set up an accelerator just over 10 years ago. What was quite circular or quite nice about that was 3 years later, he came and knocked on my door and said, "I want to open Techstars internationally. Do you want to run London for me?" And therefore, look, I said yes. But if he hadn't helped me 3 years earlier, he wouldn't have had his managing director for London. In that window of opening Techstars London, I actually had the good fortune of getting Barclays Bank on a good day and persuading them that they should run an accelerator. Myself and a good friend still scratch our heads to this day to understand how that actually happened, because banks, as you'll figure out in some of this later conversation, are notorious at being very slow decision makers. So I helped set up the Barclays Accelerator with Techstars in London and New York, which has gone on to be massively, massively successful. About a couple of years after that, I subsequently left Techstars, and as you discover when you run accelerators, you realize you never quite run away. And I got recruited to run a program in Dubai for the Dubai government and Prime Minister to set up an accelerator, which was equally interesting, because if you think banks are really slow, you should look at governments. And the concept of running an accelerator program for a government is a little bit, let's say, it's not something you would ordinarily volunteer for. But it was successful, and we can describe what that meant. But it was quite a painful process. At around the same time, I started with Motive Partners, which is who I work for right now. And we're an investment firm where we work with financial institutions, which combines investment, and we also have labs. And I'm part of the labs team that works there. And one of the things that we've tried to do is learn from previous models, which include Barclays, Dubai, and multiple other accelerators that have helped set up, to understand how you can bridge the gap between corporates and startups. And I think this is a profoundly important part or piece of what Europe has to do over the next 10 years. Because bluntly, if you want to run a B2C business, you're probably better going to California. You really need a lot of people, and you need a lot of early adopters to get some real traction. And so therefore, B2B is going to be intrinsically a very big piece of what Europe has to do to grow. And to do that, you need customers, and those are called corporates. And on the other side of the table, you have corporates who are desperately trying to figure out how they do innovation better. And so trying to think about how one bridges the gap between those two to create mutual benefit, I think is a really important kind of stage gate on Europe and startups here.
So can you share a few mistakes and maybe lessons learned about what goes wrong when corporates try to work with startups? And how can you make that work?
Just about everything goes wrong.
Yeah, okay.
So we have this internal joke, which is I speak startup, and there are other people in our organization who speak corporate. And there's not very many people who can speak both startup and corporate at the same time. And so it's just the whole language and how they address things and how they do things. It's just different. It's just really, really weird. Timelines are different. Expectations are different. How you communicate. I got told off by my boss over the weekend. So we're dealing with a bank, and they hadn't responded to one of my emails. So I have this thing, and I'm sure a few of you do this, which is you just do a reply again, and you put the word like nudge or bump or something. And my boss told me off over the weekend and said, "You can't say that. We're trying to take millions of dollars off this bank, and you've just gone nudge." So it's very, very different. What can I say to try and fix that? Hold on, keep going.
Yeah, where do you start trying to fix that? Let's say, let's go one step back, because I'm trying to ask you about processes, but maybe it's about starting with the right people. Can you give sort of a persona for, I don't know, either the startups that are easier to work with when you're a corporate and trying to find the startups that work for you, or specific types of corporates that are more prone to have success in working with
So if I start on the startup side, the one thing I would say is having someone in the founding team that actually has had the problem and has actually worked in that position. So I was talking to somebody, instant financing or instant factoring this morning, and she worked previously at a bank. So she understood what it was like inside an organization. So that really helps. When you're trying to fix a problem from outside and you've never really understood the inherent customer need, it's a real struggle. Corporates are really hard. I think whilst I'm quite cynical today, which is quite odd, about corporate accelerators, they actually represent kind of a journey corporates have to go on. So they sort of have to, they initially do some startup scouting, they might do an accelerator. The reality is that's just like, I call it training wheels for corporates to try and figure out what a startup is and feels like. It also makes it easier to actually find the front door. So sometimes it's really hard for a startup to figure out how to engage or who to engage with. And so sometimes something like an accelerator or a venture fund, whilst they're not the right people ultimately to sell product to, they are a good place to start in that process.
So that's how the program helps you. That's how the program helps the startup to find the right people in a company that they have to talk to.
Is it? I think unfortunately it's a necessary evil.
Okay.
I think the problem you have is, I call it startup tourism, which is, let's go and find a startup. Wouldn't it be jolly fun to work with a startup? It sometimes is very frustrating because you kind of, it's like a zoo where kind of the C-level execs come around the building and go, look at all of our startups that we're working with. Aren't they amazing? What do they do? I have no idea. So you do have to bear with them as they kind of go through that process. And that's the one thing I've noticed about Barclays, even when I was there and then subsequently, is the accelerator, whilst it may not be the thing that moves the needle, is the thing which actually helps them get smarter about how to deal with startups. And it's a hard and long journey that they have to go on. It's not something you can click your fingers and it suddenly gets all better. That was being described earlier, which is the biggest inherent problem is culture. Is you might find somebody warm and cuddly at the front door called an accelerator, but there's an expression in English, antibodies. Basically, you're the virus. As soon as you go into the corporate, everybody wants to try and kill you. And even if it's sometimes they're being nice to you, in the process of being nice, they're probably trying to kill you. Because they want to have another meeting. Because it's like really cool to hang out with startups. Can we come to your office, like, and hang out at your office? It's like, no, I just want a contract. Just sign a bloody contract.
Is there a sweet spot that for the startup in the life cycle of the startup when it's good for them to start working with a corporate, so as they don't get killed?
No, there's a couple of things which are worth thinking about. Two or three things actually. The first one is you really should have a product when you go to see a corporate. Don't go to them with a, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? If you go to them with a, we're ready to go moment, I think life becomes easier, part one. Part two, startups are famous for basically saying, and we can do this, 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 and we can do this. That just confuses corporates. Because what they'll then introduce you to is 5 different people in 5 different departments. And they'll think it's great because you're talking to all of these people. But it's really hard for you to focus on a particular use case. So I tend to say, look at the shiny ball. There's just one shiny ball. Don't look at anything else. This is the thing that you want to help with. The other thing that you need to think about is everybody always thinks they want to work with the biggest player in the market. And whilst they might have a brand and a reputation which would be great for you, my experience is the bigger the brand, the harder they are to work with. And so sometimes actually what I call working with tier 2 or tier 3 players initially is much easier. They tend to be smaller. They may not have an innovation department. They may have an innovation person. There's just less baggage, there's less overhead to get through. And so there's a greater chance that you can get to what's called the business unit. Because actually the weird part is all of what I've described is you want to get past innovation
Crezi că ar putea să fie
and
lumină
actually
mai
get
mult în
to
sală
the
cât ce
customer,
vorbesc
your
eu?
customer, the business unit at the other end.
Un pic mai multă,
Because then you
nu,
actually
nu
have a
foarte
fighting
multă, dar un
chance
pic mai
of
multă. Că oamenii adoră pe ei.
pulling something off.
You said you have to have a product when you go to work with a corporate, but I know at Motive Partners, you have started the Motive Lab that is trying to, as I understand it, is creating teams both from the corporate side and from the entrepreneurial side, and trying everything, hoping to build companies. Tell me about that.
So we actually do 2 things. One is we work with the banks. They come back with a long list of here's all the things which are broken in our business. And it's actually worth coming back to that. When a bank fixes a problem, they move on to something else. I'll come back to that. But essentially, they come back with a long list of here are all the things which are broken inside our business. And we do one of 2 things. One is we either try to find a startup that addresses that. And if a startup doesn't address it, then we go and think about building it. Or the third piece is sometimes we take a few startups and add them all up together to create a new product. To give you some context, last year we introduced about 50 startups. About half of them are in pilots with banks. We spun up 5 pilots, proof of concepts, of which only 1 turned into a real startup. And we're just about to spin that out. So I think sometimes they're willing to recognize that rather than having to build stuff, that they can potentially also partner with other startups. Okay. What was the other thing I was talking about?
How banks come and tell you that they have a problem that they need fixing?
No, there's something else.
Well, I missed that.
I've got a really small brain. I can't remember. It'll come back to me after I've walked off stage.
Okay. Tell me about why this process you think works. Why do you feel the need to do this?
I think there's one of two things. One is I strongly believe that no corporate innovation program accelerator should ever take equity. I think if a corporate wants to work with you, it's because it's the right thing for them to do. It's because it creates value for them and it creates value for you. You shouldn't have to give up equity to participate in that process. The other part is if you take equity, you tend to skew the process towards very early stage businesses. And actually, most of the companies that we're working with are post-seed, Series A, pre-Series A kind of window, rather than super early teams. I think, coming back to my statement, I'm a strong believer in the first thing that any startup should do is go and find customers. If you're B2C, there's a way to do that. You can kind of go out into the market, you can do Facebook advertising, whatever you might want to do. If you're a B2B business, finding customers that are receptive and corporates that are willing to try a little bit harder, sometimes break procurement processes, is the way that you can help build your businesses. And through that process and actually engaging with the right people, you are more likely to get more customers. Because also corporates are very prudent, is probably a polite way of describing them, but essentially they herd in numbers, where if you say I'm working with HSBC, you'll find every other bank will suddenly put their hand up and say, that's really cool, can I work with you as well? So they get comfort with the numbers as well. So someone like Barclays can make a real difference, and they do, where they essentially work with a bunch of startups, and you can already see other financial institutions, other banks, actually queuing up behind to work with those people. And actually what's nice about it is Barclays recognize that other banks will want to work with them as well, so they're not overly protective of them.
Who in a corporation has the right mindset, I think, and power to make this work? And I'm referring especially that when you said you don't find it appropriate for the corporate to take equity. When should they expect to see a return on their investment? And maybe who are the main actors that you need to have on board? I mean, if someone in the audience is thinking about trying to start up, to set up an innovation program in their corporation, how should this be attacked?
The hardest part of this process is it really has to come from the top of the organization.
Okay. So
it's really hard to try and do it in a corner of a bigger organization.
So you need to get to C-level.
It needs to have C-level support, because also it's a very long journey. It's not something that happens very quickly. And so therefore, coming back to Barclays, because it's the one I'm most familiar with, that started in 2013, so it's now 5 years old as a journey. I think you have to recognize that there are big changes happening and that those aren't going to happen very quickly, and you have to have, the whole organization has to recognize that this is where the change happens. Startups are a version of it. Oh, I do remember what the question was. Startups are a part of it. What's interesting from a startup's perspective is, somebody described it as, a lot of this is chance. So you have to be the right startup, and you have to be working with the corporate at the right time. And sometimes you can miss that opportunity, and that's just bad luck, unfortunately. So it's okay to be persistent and to keep harassing people, because what might not be important to them today, 3 months from now, if you go and knock on their door again, they'll suddenly go, oh, I know a use case for that now. We could work with you somewhere over here. So their priorities are constantly changing and evolving. The thing that also is interesting is, because that list of problems is such a long list, once you've fixed one of their problems, you're going to stick to that business for a very long time. So one of the banks that we work with introduced a solution, and we came back 2 years later and said, we've got a better one. They said, we really don't care, because we've got 99 other problems. And even though that's better than that, that one was so much better than the problem that we had in the first place. We have to move on and do other things. And so actually, once you embed yourself in a corporate, actually there's a really strong chance that you're going to be there for a very long time. So I always talk about trying to think about the price point, which is what's the highest price for you, but the lowest price for the corporate, just to embed yourself in. Because once you're in the organization, from a procurement point of view, your ability to spread sideways and to cross-sell actually accelerates really, really quite quickly. So coming back to the just do one simple thing, think about one use case where you can really create value and not overcomplicate it. And then you have the chance of growing like weeds, so to speak.
Okay. Do we have questions from the audience? Because we're running out of time here. If not, anybody? Okay, I'll walk that.
So we've seen a lot of ways corporates interact with startups, coming from accelerators, co-investing in funds which invest in startups, corporate programs of all things. If you would recommend one format which you think is like, let's say, a good practice in this field, just one particular program that you know of and it's really delivering results for that corporate, which one is that?
Surprisingly, it was a program I set up. So I took a lot of the learnings, and there's a program in Dublin for AgTech, for agricultural businesses, called it's with Dog Patch Labs. And essentially what we agreed with the corporate was the corporate they don't take equity, they give the startup 15,000 euros to pay for all of their expenses, but they only have to be there for 3 weeks. So it's a 13-week program. They're there on the first week, they have to be there in the middle week, and they have to be there at the end, and that's it. And they have to do a dial-in once a week. And they've dedicated sponsors that actually they match up. Every startup has a sponsor the whole way through the process. So what they're trying to do is trying to drive business development, but they recognize, because they're working with slightly later stage businesses, that they shouldn't be taking equity. They recognize that there is a cost associated with trying to work with them. But they also recognize that these people actually have another business that they need to be getting on and doing in parallel to this business development opportunity. And I've stolen a few ideas from a few other people, but it's that combination of committed resource and money, so there's a decision having to be made internally, but recognizing that they don't necessarily have to be inside your building for 13 weeks in a straight stretch, so to speak.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.